In photography, HDR has been misunderstood for so long, and I've been there teaching it since almost the beginning when we had these early digital cameras and we were bracketing and stacking, and we thought that was the only way to do it. Because when we came from film, which hit its peak in the late 90s and 2000s with these amazing high dynamic range films, then we came to the early digital cameras, and the sensors on most of our early digital cameras were much more lacking in dynamic range. Even today, if I take a super high-res scan from one of my 4x5 images, the dynamic range I can pull out of it is equal to or better than most digital cameras even in 2024. Then you enter Lightroom and Capture One in Photoshop and merging and plugins, and the fact that there's an HDR mode in Lightroom now, and it all gets even more confusing. As I was doing a bunch of revamps in Lightroom and Capture One for my natural HDR pack, I was really digging into the nuances and the latest features in these apps in terms of how we can manage dynamic range, the modes, the masks, the sliders. HDR is not that complicated. It's an understanding of shadow and light, like we talk about all the time in my Shadow Hackers live workshops. Link for those in the comments if you want a free ticket. I can cover HDR in a simple video, Gavin. Sure you can, I said to myself. Well, fine then, let's do it, I said to myself, and we'll see if it actually makes sense to you guys. You let me know in the comments. Now, the reason HDR confuses people so much is because a lot of people think HDR is a look, a style, or an app where you have to have a merged HDR like I did of my Lone Collection winning Seattle Skyline image in the early 2000s. Even though I bracketed and stacked this image, I did a lot of burning and dodging and refinement to maintain its natural look while having that dynamic range. And even today, I'm proud of it. It doesn't have that overcooked, nasty HDR look. When I'm doing fashion portraits, I use high dynamic range in the terms of managing my shadow and my highlight and thinking about what surrounds those images so that I really do get a balanced dynamic range, skin tones, backgrounds, sunsets, and this can all be done on single file. Let me show you what I mean. Here is a single raw file from the Grand Tetons. Now you can see that I've chosen the darker exposure for this because as I show you guys in shadow hacking workshops, it's actually a lot easier to recover shadows than to recover highlights, which is why exposed to the right, as I've shown in other videos here on the channel, is normally a bad idea. I'm a little dark, so I'm going to push this up by one stop. I'm going to go over to Natural HDR presets and just apply the HDR Mistscape preset. Now, this is, of course, stuff you can totally do manually if you don't have a presets. That said, you can download a free sampler of some free HDR presets from my Natural HDR pack. I'll put a link in the comments. Regardless of whether you're in Lightroom, Capture One, etc., you have this information in the raw file. Now, we still need to recover our sky a bit, and this has gotten a lot easier now that we have AI masks in Lightroom and Capture One. So I'll often go to an AI mask preset like my Elegant Speed masks, or in this case, I'm going to use the HDR Sky Mix that's inside my Natural HDR4. Now you can see I'm almost getting too much dynamic range. I'm going to go turn down the HDI sky because I don't want to get an overcooked HDR look. And now I can manually tweak this a little bit to balance out how much I want it. The amount of dynamic range in a single file today is truly astounding. And the truth is you rarely need to bracket. In fact, sometimes it's a worse idea to bracket because it gives you more opportunity to bring in other artifacts and problems. Let me show you what I mean, and then we'll also look at the HDR mode in Lightroom and see how that relates. If I take these three images, a dark, a medium, and a light taken in the Twin Cities at the old flour mill, and merge them, I can use a third-party plugin, but I can also just use Photo Merge and bring these three images into an HDR stack right within Lightroom. I can also do this within Photoshop. Now, of course, the options within Merge HDR are fairly limited with the default tools. Some people like a Lightroom Infuse plugin. I used to use all the time apps like Photomatics and things like that when I was still doing a lot of stacked HDR. I even did them for portraits, and I taught a lot of workshops back in the day about the techniques of getting it all balanced. Then the sensors got better, and I started shifting my HDR education to understanding the shadow and the light and how to use it. I've gone ahead and merged these, and the result I get is this. You can see I have these three images, and then I could go in and use those same presets and sliders sliders and mix it up the way I want to get a balanced HDR out of this that looks the way I like it. And yet you notice here, even though we had that dark image, we're still having a lot of problems with those high highlights here. The question is, in 2024, with all the tools and the noise reduction abilities and the algorithms to push and pull and manipulate the presets to do single file HDRs, do we need to do that? We're going to take the dark version of this, the one that has the brightness, the highlights of that high dynamic range sky intact. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to push this by 2 stops. Now you notice we brought a lot of shadows back. Rather than mess with all the sliders manually, I'm going to make it easy for myself, and I'm just going to go to the magic push 4.1 from Natural HDR 4. Now we have this fairly high dynamic range scene. We just need a little more in our sky. I'm going to do the same thing I just did on that other image, and I'm going to go down to the AI HDR sky mix, or I could also go to elegance, or I could manually do sky masking. Look what we just did here. In 2 clicks with the dark image, we went from this to this. Notice how I intentionally used the darker image, because if I tried this on the bright image, the highlights wouldn't recover. I can do way more recovering shadows. And also, if you have a few dark shadows, it's not really a bad thing. You need shadows in a high dynamic range image. The biggest mistake people have made ever since the beginning in high dynamic range is they crush their histogram to the midtone. The reason we started doing that is because most of the apps that merged images, they kind of pushed all those tones into the mid-range, and then they expected us to edit them, not to always have this hyper real, over the top, super clarity, intense look that looks something like this. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with coming in here and manually pushing up your clarity and mixing things up to get the look you want. But what I want to focus on is the dynamic range. We pushed up by 2 stops, then we used an HDR single file preset from Natural HDR and a sky mask preset. And that's it. Now I could push the saturation up a little bit. I could move this around, but look at this image. This is not the latest Sony or Fuji or Canon camera. This was actually taken on my old 5D Mark II. It was a great camera, and it was one of the turning points where sensors started to get more dynamic range from the early 2000s cameras like the 10Ds and the early Nikons and things like that. But the cameras today obviously have better sensors than this did. Which one is my bracketed HDR? Well, it does look a little more HDR-ified, and we have lifted the shadows a little more, although there's some artifacting down there. What you see from the HDR merge is we're still struggling in those highlights. Now, I could work with that more. I could paint those in Photoshop, etc. But look at the naturalness of the single file HDR. Notice how the sky is much smoother, how throughout the image, even though I've had to do some noise reduction on it because we pushed that old file so hard, everything is really crisp and clean. The plants are actually a little bit cleaner because we weren't merging the plants together from multiple images, so there's less motion blur. The single file HDR, the better edit, it has richer shadows, it has better highlights, and it just works beautifully. Okay, fine, Gavin. You can do great HDR images from a single file. And don't think that always means it has to look like an HDR. The goal here is that you're taking areas that have its deepest shadows and its highest highlights. You're dealing with a scene, a portrait, whatever it is, that has a high dynamic range, and you're taking that 3-dimensional world and you're merging it in to a balance between those shadows and highlights. Okay, fine, but what about for us Lightroom users? Now we have HDR mode. What does that mean? Well, let's actually go back to the develop module after we've edited this with presets, a few sliders, and let's switch the color mode on this to HDR, which is going to change. It extends our gamut. Now, what just happened though? Our file got worse. Let's undo that, and you see here. Let's go back, and you see here. Okay, the problem is, what HDR did is it extended. It looks like we've extended the histogram even though our file doesn't really go up that high. What's confusing people in Lightroom is they think that clicking this HDR box is going to give them more dynamic range. It doesn't. This is just to edit in a wider gamut that's made for HDR displays, like an HDR TV, the HDR screen on your phone, or an HDR monitor. It's giving no more dynamic range to your file. It's changing the space to let you edit in an HDR mode. How HDR on a screen if what you're putting in isn't HDR? Well, think about it when you buy a TV. They talk about your black ratios. They talk about HDR modes. Think about an OLED TV or a micro dimming TV. What they're talking about when they say HDR is these TVs are hugely bright on their backlight, right? So they have a lot of light pushing through, but the pixels are also able to remain really dark in the case of like an OLED. If you have a flagship phone like an iPhone or a Samsung, it pushes enough light through the screen, enough nits. It pushes 1500 nits of brightness so you can see it in bright light, but at the same time, the black pixels can remain truly black. The dynamic range between the black and the white is very wide, giving you a high dynamic range display. Don't overthink that. All of that means here in Lightroom is if you were creating images to be displayed specifically for these HDR displays, you could then work in that wider HDR mode. Notice how when I click that little exclamation mark, it says high dynamic range display is currently unavailable. Areas of the photo brighter than SDR will not be previewed accurately. That's why it's clipping. We haven't actually lost more information on the file, but my editing monitor isn't HDR. So when I switch to HDR mode, my photo looks worse, not because there's no information there, but because look, my brightest highlights are pushing over into that wider HDR mode. If I exported this and displayed it on an HDR display with all the right settings and had everything formatted correctly, it would still look good. The point I'm getting at here is unless you're doing something specific for HDR content creation, this HDR mode has nothing to do with getting high dynamic range in your photos. Let's just go back and turn HDR mode off, and you can see it's now back to the gamut that's displaying for a normal screen, and everything looks the way it should be. HDR came from how I edited in balancing those deep darks with the bright highlights. It wasn't a question of whether I bracketed. It wasn't a question of what the image was of, how much clarity, how much sharpness, or what style it had. On this here again, I went to natural HDR. I used Dynaportrait and I used Sky HDR mods and some AI tools here to get a nice balanced image. Here is my raw file. You can see it's pretty bright. Here is my finished image. These were exposed a little bit high key, so I have to work a little bit harder to recover my skies. I can mix up the masks, add more blue, things like that to get the look I want for this higher key mix. But it's important to understand that the exposure does matter. What we're saying here is not just expose wherever you want and fix it later. Plan for the kind of look you're going for. And normally a darker exposure, in my experience, is going to let you recover better, get richer skies, and still maintain that shadow rich detail. Here's another example here, again exposing a little bit dark. I explain more why I do this in my Shadow Hackers workshop. Let's save time. Let's go to the HDR landscape preset, and then I'm going to go right down to the AI HDR sky mod. Notice it's still a little dark, but I've recovered my dynamic range. I'm just going to push it up a little bit right here. Now I could fine tune this a little bit, of course, and usually I will, but look how we came from here to here. Yes. There's that much dynamic range in your single files, especially if you understand the use of zones, if you understand the use of shadows, and if you're exposing with the balance of those shadows and their relationship to highlights in mind. The correct exposure in camera makes a huge difference. And the correct exposure is not necessarily what your meter tells you. You want to be controlling the correct exposure based on your knowledge of how to hack shadows and how to manipulate highlights. You'll be able to manage your shadows and your highlights, whether you're going for a more lo-fi portrait look or whether you're going for a true high dynamic range, intense sunset. The main thing you want to do is make sure you're shooting in RAW, not JPEG, because if you shoot JPEG, despite what people might tell you about the in-camera filters being great or all that kind of stuff, all you're doing is losing. The only thing you gain is some hard disk space. Even when I'm shooting my Fuji cameras, which are famous for their in-camera profiles, I'm not using those in-camera profiles. I'm taking the raw photo, and then in post, you can add the in-camera profile in something like Lightroom or Capture One, or in my case, I'm just going straight to my Filmus presets because I get even more control than I would for the in-camera profile. Even if I'm using something like Classic Negative, I'm just doing it with the preset that's in Filmus 2. And yes, you can download the free pack of that as well, and even get the Classic Negative preset as well as a Portrait preset over on the Filmist page. These different kinds of edits are important, right? Because we can have a natural HDR or a high dynamic range look that takes a file from this to this, or we can have a softer film-based look that takes a file from this to this. Both are using the principles of shadows and understanding high dynamic range, and you can decide whether you want more of an organic film, subtle kind of look, or whether you want a bold HDR look. You can even use the principles of these high dynamic range edits for a more lo-fi, low dynamic range look. You'll notice that I'm carefully controlling the dynamic range here in highlights and shadows, even though it's a more soft, muted, film-like look. It's more of a lo-fi look, and yet it's still incorporating the principles of high dynamic range to balance out those deep shadows from our model to the highlights coming in. I hope this made sense. I hope you hit that bell icon, like, subscribe for more videos, because we talk a lot about shadow hacking, about tone. This has been a summary of high dynamic range and how to use it. You take it from here. All right, you guys, we'll see you next time.